I was addressing things as the supervisor. There will be no comments, there will be anything. It would be me addressing you guys, telling you what's going on in the township.
In our CBA, that's our collective bargaining agreement, that's our union contract. So it comes with the seat. That's what people are not saying. I didn't make this up.
Once viewed as an unstoppable force in Dalton politics, Tiffany Henyard is now at the center of an expanding investigation that is rocking her inner circle and beyond. Her name is all over the news, but not for the reason she had hoped: allegations of corruption. The people who formerly supported her, including her own spouse, are now turning against her more quickly as the financial wrongdoing and power abuse mount up and the attention surrounding her questionable actions increases daily. The federal government is reportedly conducting an extensive investigation into Tiffany's affairs, and those she once trusted to protect her are now collaborating with law enforcement in their pursuit of justice. To understand how Tiffany's world fell apart, it's crucial to look at the path she took to power, a journey marked not only by ambition, but also by a carefully crafted image of inability to be vulnerable. As the investigation into her shady dealings gained momentum, Tiffany found herself unable to escape the mounting pressure. During her time in office, she surrounded herself with devoted allies whose devotion seemed unwavering. But many of these individuals had their own dubious reputations, creating an intricate web of enablers and scapegoats. Tiffany had strategically built a network of fall guys who she believed would take charge if any illicit activities were exposed. Evading responsibility, Tiffany tried to hide from the media in the hopes that the storm would pass and the controversy would subside, but the FBI was allegedly closing in, making it harder for her to stay out of the spotlight. As soon as she made an attempt to go missing, it became apparent that her authority was eroding and that those she had depended on were no longer prepared to shield her from the fallout from her actions. One by one, her purported protectors started to change, and the barriers she had put up around herself began to collapse, and the most shocking betrayal came from her own partner, Kamal Woods. Kamal, though he had been presented as a devoted friend, his willingness to assist investigators suggests that his involvement in Tiffany's alleged schemes was far more complicated than anyone first thought. Tiffany's longtime boyfriend was not only romantically connected to her, but also heavily involved in her business operations, making his involvement a crucial part of the investigation. Having been appointed director of Tiffany's Cancer Foundation, Kamal was not merely a supporting character in her life. Rather, he was an important one. Already sparked concerns, investigators are questioning whether the foundation, which was supposedly established to support breast cancer patients, was actually a charitable organization or just a publicity stunt. On the day the foundation was formally launched, it received a sizable donation, which fueled further speculation about its true purpose. As authorities dug deeper into its financial records, many investigators began to suspect that the foundation was being used as a front for other less charitable endeavors. This revelation, together with the disintegration of Tiffany's support network, she found herself in a vulnerable situation with nowhere to retreat to after being perceived as untouchable. Given that federal authorities are closing in on her once loyal supporters and the public is demanding answers, Tiffany must now confront the unpleasant fact that her political empire may be on the brink of complete collapse. How long can she continue to avoid the repercussions of her actions? The probe has also raised grave questions regarding her misappropriation of public monies. Reports show that she spent taxpayer. She allegedly used taxpayer dollars to pay her employees, including Kamal Woods, who played a significant role in her dubious dealings despite the mounting red flags, in order to finance a trip outside of Dalton to promote her foundation. This practically turned public funds into a tool for advancing her personal agenda. Under the guise of her untouchability, Tiffany continued to direct public funds into her foundation, but when federal authorities intervened, things started to drastically change. The feds arrived with a subpoena, requesting access to important records pertaining to her financial dealings. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Kamal's name surfaced in the subpoenas, indicating that authorities were extending their probe beyond Tiffany and into the financial activities of those in her family. Kamal had been receiving a paycheck from Tiffany's dubious foundation until she was exposed for landing a lucrative job in Thornton Township, earning a salary of over $100,000, an amount most Dalton residents could only dream of. Within the circle, Tiffany was the target of 2 subpoenas, one of which probed her private business affairs. Investigators discovered a complex network of enterprises that were as shady as her political affairs, including a restaurant and a property management company, both of which raised serious doubts about their legitimacy. One particularly heinous instance involves a renter who lost their house in 2019 as a result of dangerous living circumstances, such as a mold-infested and leaking building, providing unmistakable proof that Tiffany's business practices were far from moral, as the Tiffany's empire was founded on deceit and financial manipulation, as the investigation into her affairs revealed. What makes this collapse even more dramatic is that the very people she trusted to safeguard her interests are now helping law enforcement pursue justice. Tiffany's long-standing habit of taking shortcuts, misusing authority, and putting her own money ahead of the community's well-being is finally catching up with her in ways she never would have imagined. Her days of unbridled power are coming to an end, and the most shocking betrayal of all comes from her own baby daddy, who was once regarded as a reliable figure in her life, but is now allegedly cooperating with authorities. His willingness to provide information could be the last straw that destroys Tiffany's meticulously crafted facade of power and influence as the investigation gathers steam. A scathing picture is being painted as more of Tiffany's secrets are revealed. Of a leader who put personal gain ahead of the duties of public service, the once loyal supporters who enabled her to stay in power are now abandoning her, making sure that law enforcement has all they require to hold her responsible. The tale of Tiffany Henyard serves as a warning about the dangers of corruption and unbridled ambition, reminding us that even those who think they are untouchable can be overthrown by the very people they once trusted. What started out as a quick ascent to power is now degenerating into a dramatic and dishonoring downfall whenever a new discovery is made. As Tiffany deals with the repercussions of her acts, it appears that her fate is increasingly set in stone. There's no doubt that this saga's next chapter will be much more explosive. The full scope of her alleged crimes will soon be revealed, and with federal investigators closing in on erstwhile pals who testified against her and her once loyal inner circle dissolving, Tiffany Henyard's reign seems to be coming to an abrupt and unavoidable end.
Damage, and then it leaked one into my kitchen, and the window sill leaked in my daughter's room.
Except they weren't. Enter activist David Lowry, who called Dalton directly. Suddenly, the house deemed livable on September 3rd became unfit for occupancy on October 15th. Lowry's theory?
The trustee group.
Just 6 months after taking over as supervisor of Thornton Township, the FBI began looking deeper into Tiffany Henyard's operations, realizing that they needed a complete understanding of her business dealings. Previously, federal authorities requested all records related to her political fund, charity foundation, and township operations, signaling that her financial activities were under intense scrutiny. As the investigation into her alleged corruption thickened, more people came forward to expose her actions, a development she should have anticipated given the controversy that had surrounded her administration from the beginning. Long before the federal probe began, Tiffany had already been the target of growing criticism from within her own ranks, especially from members of her so-called Dream Team, a group she personally chose to assist her in managing the township. Tiffany probably thought this would be a cooperative and loyal administration, but the truth was far from that. Initially, Harmon trustees Tiana Beller and Jason House, as well as village clerk Allison Key, were supposed to be her closest allies, but they soon turned into some of her most outspoken critics, refusing to overlook the unethical and questionable decisions she was making. Quickly turned what should have been a united front in governance into a nightmare for Tiffany, as the very people she had handpicked to support her started to question her leadership and expose her questionable actions. Tensions increased, and the trustees, who had initially been chosen for their perceived loyalty, started working with the village board to take legal action against Tiffany, accusing her of serious conflicts of interest. Their main concern was the mounting evidence that she was using her position to further her own financial and personal interest rather than to serve the people of Dalton. Occurred only 6 months into her term, revealing the deep divisions within her administration and strengthening the growing opposition against her. Rather than accepting responsibility for her actions or addressing the trustees' concerns, Tiffany retaliated in a desperate attempt to regain control, accusing them of purposefully causing controversy and working against her vision to make Dalton great. By doing this, she portrayed herself as a victim of a political witch hunt rather than an official under investigation for serious misconduct, which only served to widen the gap between her and her former. Tiffany's allies made it apparent that she would not admit any wrongdoing, but the federal investigation into her business dealings only made it harder for her to maintain the facade of legitimacy she had carefully built. The FBI was looking into every aspect of her political fund and charity foundation, raising even more questions about how public funds were being managed under her leadership. What had started as whispers of corruption quickly turned into an unquestionable storm of allegations, as more people came forward to reveal the truth about her administration. The turning point was when those who had previously been Tiffany's most ardent supporters publicly distanced themselves from her after realizing that there could be serious legal repercussions for being associated with her. Tiffany, who had previously presented herself as untouchable, was now witnessing her empire fall apart before her eyes, and every effort to silence her detractors seemed to backfire, further solidifying the idea that she was more focused on protecting herself than the township she had been. Chosen to serve in the LW suit brought by the trustees further solidified the notion that Tiffany's administration was rife with conflicts of interest. As the legal battles mounted, it became more and more obvious that Tiffany was running out of options. What had begun as an unstoppable ascent to power was now a slow but inevitable decline, driven by her own actions and the unwillingness of those around her to continue supporting her. The more the investigation deepened, the more it became clear that Tiffany's leadership had been founded on a foundation of corruption, manipulation, self-serving decisions, and her refusal to accept responsibility. Combined with her aggressive attempts to retaliate against anyone who opposed her, it only served to hasten her downfall. The very people she had depended on to protect her were now part of those working to hold her accountable, with former allies against her and federal authorities determined to uncover the full extent of her misdeeds. Tiffany Henyard's political career seemed to be in its final chaotic chapter as the investigation gained momentum. Tiffany's tactics became more authoritarian and darker, and she started excluding trustees from their offices in an effort to intimidate them. But instead of giving up, the trustees remained resolute in their resolve to remove her. Some might have wondered if they were going too far, but the truth was that Tiffany's leadership had been failing Dalton in practically every way. During her tenure, the town was dealing with urgent problems such as crumbling roads, abandoned and dilapidated homes, and a police force in dire need of resources. However, Tiffany continued to waste public funds on unnecessary expenses rather than addressing these urgent issues. Prior to Tiffany becoming mayor, Dalton had been a town that valued community unity and concentrated on doing what was best for its citizens. Tiffany's extravagant spending, however, was one of the most egregious examples of her self-serving governance. She used taxpayer funds for unnecessary billboards featuring her face, first-class flights, luxurious accommodations at upscale hotels like the Four Seasons, high-profile DJs, professional photographers, and even a full security team for her own protection. These expenses painted a clear picture of a leader more concerned with personal interests. However, under her leadership, everything seemed to revolve around her personal image. Any event that didn't directly promote her or elevate her status was either canceled or purposefully undermined. An important annual tradition for the residents of Dalton, the event was scheduled to go forward as planned, but Tiffany refused to grant permission for the use of the public park because she had scheduled her own competing event just a few miles away and didn't want anything to take attention away from it. In an extreme move to ensure the community gathering couldn't take place, she ordered massive cement blocks to be placed at the location. Her behavior became even more evident when she deliberately interfered with a long-standing community event because it didn't revolve around her. Tiffany Henyard's political career had once been full of promises of change and progress for Dalton, but as time went on, it became clear that she was more concerned with maintaining her status and power than with serving the very community that had entrusted her with public office. This was evident when she physically blocked residents from entering the park, demonstrating the extent to which she prioritized her personal reputation over the welfare and traditions of Dalton. It became increasingly apparent that Tiffany's goals had little to do with bettering the lives of those she was supposed to serve. Rather, she became fixated on preserving power, stifling criticism, and exalting herself. The trustees, realizing that Tiffany's leadership had turned into a liability to the town, were forced to take matters into their own hands and worked behind the scenes to find ways to limit her influence and eventually remove her from office. As the months went by, Tiffany's actions continued to reveal her true priorities, including self-promotion, reckless financial decisions, and retaliation against anyone who dared to challenge her. While Dalton's roads were in disrepair, essential services were underfunded, and the town was dealing with a number of urgent problems. Tiffany went to great lengths to maintain her public image, using taxpayer dollars to build a grandiose persona instead of addressing the community's issues. Her leadership, which had once been seen as a promising new chapter for Dalton, quickly turned into a warning about unbridled ego, financial responsibility, and political manipulation. As the investigation into her administration gathered steam and her detractors' voices became louder, it became more and more clear that Henyard was not a community leader. Rather, she was a self-centered politician who used every resource at her disposal to enhance her image at the expense of the people she was elected to represent. One of the most well-known instances that demonstrated Tiffany's egocentric style of governance occurred when the mayor abruptly canceled an annual car show that local resident Bosley had organized in the parking lot of Neo Park in Dalton. The event had become a beloved tradition, and Bosley had paid $11,000 to the park district for the required permit, only to receive a call last Wednesday from Tiffany Henyard's top assistant warning. On the Saturday morning of the event, Bosley arrived at the Needle Park to find massive concrete barricades at the entrance and Dalton police threatening to tow any cars parked there. It became evident to many that Tiffany was willing to go to great lengths to ensure that her own self-promotional spectacle was not overshadowed by a community gathering. The car show cancellation was just one example of how Tiffany's leadership was centered on personal gain. The assistant informed him that the show would be shut down, but suggested that if he moved the event to Tiffany's location on Greenwood, he could proceed without any problems. Rather than the needs of her constituents, Tiffany's actions were far from the most scandalous moments of her tenure. The audacity of canceling a beloved community event in favor of a self-serving show was a clear example of her egotistical leadership style. Recently, another insider, Carmen Corral, came forward to expose Tiffany's manipulative tactics in a public statement. Carlisle revealed that over the past 2 years, Henyard had been systematically manipulating staff, vendors, and residents to consolidate her power and maintain an iron grip on the township. This revelation confirmed what? Despite growing allegations and an intensifying federal investigation, Tiffany refused to accept responsibility for her actions, arguing that her right-hand man Keith Freeman should bear the brunt of the blame for the corruption, financial mismanagement, and abuse of power in her administration. Many saw this attempt to shift the blame as a last-ditch attempt to save herself because the walls surrounding her Tiffany Henyard had long been in place. Presented herself as a polished and successful leader, but in reality, her success had been built on the backs of hardworking taxpayers from Thornton Township and the village of Dalton. As investigators went through the layers of her administration, it became evident that her carefully curated image of success was little more than an illusion, one that was maintained through manipulation, intimidation, and reckless spending. Meanwhile, Keith Freeman, Tiffany's close and trusted ally, found himself in legal trouble of his own after being charged with fraud in a separate FBI investigation, further confirming the pervasive corruption within Hens. When more insiders came forward with damning information about Tiffany's behavior, it became more and more obvious that her political empire had been built on deceit, the trust she had demanded from her staff, the loyalty she had expected from her allies, and the fact that those who had once supported Tiffany were now either turning against her or falling with her. The irony of her trying to place the blame on Freeman while he was dealing with his own legal issues was not lost on the public. It was only a matter of time until Tiffany Henyard faced the full consequences of her misconduct. She had spent years manipulating the system to serve her own interests, but now that the truth had come to light and those closest to her had abandoned her, she was forced to face the reality of her actions. The ongoing federal investigation ensured that every fraudulent transaction, misuse of taxpayer dollars, and abuse of power was being meticulously examined. Bo Brinley, Tiffany Henyard's criminal defense lawyer, attempted to defend her by blaming Freeman, claiming that Freeman had been the one responsible for decisions regarding how funds were spent. Brinley argued that Tiffany, as a new mayor, was unaware that using taxpayer funds for first-class flights, luxurious accommodations at establishments like the Four Seasons, and lavish spending on public image was improper. Brinley claimed that Freeman had assured her that these expenses were acceptable, but despite this, Tiffany Henyard trusted Freeman to guide her. As ridiculous as all of this may sound, some Dalton residents still supported Tiffany Henyard, arguing that she had made politics more approachable and entertaining. They dismissed the growing accusations and investigations as political attacks, claiming that the mayor had been unfairly singled out and that the negative portrayals of her were exaggerated. Additionally, despite the overwhelming evidence of corruption, mismanagement, and abuse of power, Tiffany was able to maintain a devoted following, largely because of this defense. Tiffany's ability to manipulate the narrative through social media, which enabled her to portray herself as a celebrity rather than a public servant, meant that every time she shared something online, it quickly gained traction and solidified her reputation as a well-known figure in the community. However, just because Tiffany had a following and a social media presence did not shield her from criticism. In fact, as more revelations about her administration surfaced, more people began to call for accountability, with locals demanding justice for the alleged fraud and the misappropriation of public funds. People wanted Tiffany Henyard to be held accountable for her alleged crimes and misdeeds. If she weren't, many wondered what that said about the system that allowed her to operate with such impunity for so long. The ongoing investigation created growing frustration among many residents, who felt that the longer Tiffany remained in power, the more she should be held accountable. As the revelations continued to come to light, residents became increasingly disillusioned and demanded that Tiffany Henyard face a lengthy adult timeout for her actions, regardless of her devoted fan base or whether or not her supporters wanted to acknowledge it. The truth was that Tiffany's leadership had been marked by scandal after scandal, and her attempts to shift blame, silence critics, and portray herself as a victim only served to illustrate the extent of the corruption. While some still viewed her as a troubled leader who was misunderstood, the majority acknowledged a troubling pattern of behavior that had defined our tenure. The debate over Tiffany Henyard's fate was still going on, and everyone had an opinion on whether she should remain in office or be removed and held accountable. Her use of taxpayer money for personal gain, her alleged fraudulent activities, and her prioritization of self-promotion over the well-being of Dalton residents had all contributed to her quick fall from grace. Regardless of one's stance on the matter, the case of Tiffany Henyard served as a warning about the perils of unbridled political power and the significance of holding elected officials accountable for their actions, which the people of the world deserve. Keeping her loyal base of supporters should not shield her from the consequences of her actions. Doing so would set a dangerous precedent for future politicians who might attempt to follow in her footsteps. As the investigation proceeded, it was unclear whether Tiffany would be held accountable for her actions or continue to manipulate the system and avoid accountability. This was due to her openness, honesty, and leadership that put the needs of the community before her own goals.